All right. So this week we will be talking about narrative delivery in games and all that fun stuff. Hello, Jess. All right, if everyone's here, we can just get started. I'm sorry if I'm a little bit flustered. This week has been a doozy. So, narrative delivery is... Okay, sorry, I'm a bit of a mess here. Zoom does not make interfacing very easy. Okay, so what better place to start talking about game stories than with exposition? We all know it, and if you are familiar with it, you likely hate it to some extent. Oh, that's awesome, Jordan. All right, so exposition. You're all familiar with like the big lore dump at the beginning of the game, whatever it is you're playing, a la Skyrim. And basically, that's pretty boring. No one really enjoys sitting through all that stuff. So a basic rule of thumb that I like to follow is that you treat your exposition like a tutorial to your story. Just like how tutorials get your players used to the controls, your exposition should be getting them used to the world and the story that you're making. And as you are all probably familiar with, the way to do an effective tutorial is to tell them like what buttons to hit when they need to hit them. So like, tell them the WASDA stuff right up at the start. Once they get to a place where they need to jump, then you show them like press space to jump, all that stuff. In a similar vein, you'll give like your like the bare bones of your exposition that you need when they become relevant early in your story. That's generally a good rule of thumb to follow, because like I'm sure you've all seen that one game that just gives you all of the controls in a big screen right up at the front, right up at the start. And I guarantee that you've forgotten some key binding at some point in time. If you just give a big lore dump at the beginning of your game, similar things are likely going to happen. Your players are going to forget something important, and then you're probably going to end up having to remind them about it anyways, which is just kind of wasting their time and wasting your time. So for this, like slow drip feed is usually a pretty good way to go. And this is generally a good rule of thumb for all storytelling, but games especially, which is show, don't tell. And I'm sure you've heard that a lot, but like, especially in games, it is a huge thing to keep in mind, because like I saw one analytic in a video that I referenced for this, where like compared to an average like TV series, which takes up about as much time as like a narrative heavy AAA game, most TV series get about like 120-ish words per minute, but in like some AAA games that the video creator sampled, the average was about 16 words per minute for most games. So in games, every single word is precious. So they all have to be important. So a good way to because I just lost my train of thought. So because all of your words are precious, you need to give all of them like double meaning if you can. So sneak some sort of narrative or character into instructions if you have to give instructions or directions. A good way to give a lot of story very concisely and make sure that the player notices it, because that's another issue, is to look for sort of those travel segments where you have to get from point A to point B, or just even downtime moments in between heavy sections of gameplay where your players are going to be their attention isn't being split between the narrative and the action. Where there's little action, you can put in more narrative to keep them engaged, and then you know that they're paying more attention to it, so that's where you can put the more important things. And this is kind of where the little ghost picture comes in. you should be trying to avoid throwaway or meaningless lines that are really just there to fill space in your story, because, you know, if you only have 16 words per minute to make use of, you don't want to be wasting them on like meaningless banter that doesn't advance the story or tell you more about the characters in the world. You always want to be giving those words meaning, which is really the focus of this. I genuinely do not know. Okay, there we go. So as far as story progression goes, this is just kind of like a couple of side notes. I cannot find a good place to put my chat. Okay. So some ways that games commonly convey like story progression is that they will also reflect that in either like the environment or the world building. So you know how like in some games, as you get closer to the big bad, everything will start to get all dark and grim. They'll usually pull in a bunch of reds and purples if it's a very color heavy game. And they will also often tie shifts in the plot and like major character development to unlocking new abilities and weapons, because, you know, that's honestly kind of what the player cares about the most in your game, is like, you know, what about this development lets me do something cool, you know? So like, I didn't put a picture here because I forgot to, but I saw an example in the latest God of War game where after, like, I'm not familiar with the plot, so I might be getting this wrong, but I believe there's a point where like Kratos goes through like some major character development. He has to sort of like reclaim his past as like the God of War and all of that fun stuff, because he's been trying to distance himself from that now that he has like a family and all that. So after he reclaims his past, you get his old weapons back, which is like, so that's kind of like a pretty good example of that. And then one other thing to keep in mind is that video games have a few very unique strengths, and they're very strong strengths. It's that because the audience, the players, they have an active role in the medium, unlike, you know, books, TV, movies, where they're all passive viewers. Here they have like their interactions with the world and their experiences. That's really what the game is. So a good way to make your story much more engaging and to show the progress of your story is to implement consequences of your players' actions into later story beats. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So now we're sort of getting into the, you know, I'm blanking on the word right now. The nuts and bolts, there we go, the nuts and bolts of like how to deliver your story and like different ways that you can. So games specifically have like this sort of, I don't know, sort of like a progression thing that a lot of other mediums don't have. And that's that you can have continuous stories and contained stories. In most forms of media, most of the stories are contained. They're like one narrative with a beginning, middle, and an end. And like, so there's one story that you tell. For some TV shows, like they can fall into the continuous category, but the broad majority of traditional media focuses on contained stories. But I'm sure you can think of several games that have like continuous stories that are constantly being updated. So like here, like especially in like evolving games like MMOs that have constant updates, you will also often have them get story updates with those. So I guess I should probably talk about like the differences between these two. So for continuous stories, it's in the name. They're dynamic, they're evolving, and they tend to be pretty spread out. Some of the pros about continuous stories is that you have a lot more opportunities to have the players make meaningful impacts on the stories, because since you are developing the story as they are playing, you can fine-tune developments based on not only what they did, but how they did it. And this can really help to make your story feel less structured and a lot more just like, it gives your players a sense of like they're actually having an impact, which is something that a lot of other media doesn't have. The only issue here is that as you get more players and as your game gets older, newer players may miss a lot of the older narrative developments. So in that case, you don't want them to be in the dark about it, because then they're not getting the full experience. So you have to find some way to fill them in on it. And then another sort of pitfall with continuous storytelling is that if you have sort of like a formula, because like, I mean, it's good if you have sort of a formula, but if you stick to it too rigidly, if too many details fall into the same place too many times, people are going to notice, and they are going to notice it quickly. Like maybe the third time that you repeat a story, like a plot element or a character, people are going to notice, and it's going to be a little bit weird. But at the same time, it can make development of continuous stories a lot easier. So it's sort of like a balancing act that you have to strike for a continuous story. And then for contained stories, like I said, they're tighter, more focused narrative, and they also tend to be more compacted, I guess is what you could say. There's less downtime between major story plots. Because like in some games, there may be like other things that you can do, side quests. There may be like some sort of farming or survival aspect to it, which is in one of the examples I have later. But all of the story is already there. Your players can hit it whenever they want. They don't have to wait for the story to come out. Yes, that is, Breath of the Wild is actually a very good example of that. But yeah, so your players won't have to wait for you to release a new part of the story. They can just hit it whenever they want to. And contained stories are far better. Well, I won't say better, but they're easier to like sort of pin together with that sort of player progression that I mentioned earlier. So in contained stories, you have a sort of sense already of where the player will be at a specific plot point, and you can sort of string them together so that you get those character developments meshing up with like new abilities and that sort of thing. Whereas in continuous stories, that's a little bit harder to pull off, but it's not impossible. And another thing that contained stories have that continuous stories tend to struggle with is that they have an end, which is kind of hard to like wrap your head around, because that's the thing with stories. They have a beginning, middle, and an end. But in many continuous stories, there isn't really an ending. It just keeps building and building, whereas in contained stories, you know where you're going. So that can kind of help you shape your story and make it more cohesive. But at the same time, you don't have like all the freedom in the world to like, you couldn't release a brand new like type of enemy at the very end and have like all these things planned out for them. There's no way that you would be able to pull that off in a contained story, whereas in a continuous story, you could just shift the focus a little bit and then follow that plot point as much as you'd like. Which kind of brings me to the next point, is that in contained stories, there's less room for branching narratives, and there's less room for you to take player choice into account, which is why contained stories tend to have the whole illusion of choice thing, where there are like branching paths that you can go down, kind of like, Telltale games are probably the most obvious example of this, but there's like specific choices that the player can make, and that sets them down a path. But like, you know, you can't shape the path based off of what they do. It's significantly more rigid, but that's in no way a bad thing. Just depends on the story you'd like to tell. Okay, so these are sort of two examples that I picked for like to show the differences between continuous and contained stories. So there's Warframe and there's Starbound. I picked them because they're decently similar. They're both in a futuristic setting, heavily reliant on space travel. Their narrative development is delivered specifically through quests, boss fights, and item descriptions. And most importantly, their core gameplay loop is not story-driven. So like in a lot of other games, the narrative, you have a story and you are following the story and that is the game. But in these two, the core gameplay loop isn't really story-based, and you can sort of follow the story developments whenever you want, basically. So Warframe, they don't do this anymore, but they used to have these events where basically there would be two sides that you could pick. There were two factions that you could align yourself with. And depending on which faction got the most support from the majority of the player base, then they would implement the consequences of siding with that faction. So here, the Gradavis dilemma is probably the most well-known one. This is when they like implemented a new Warframe and everything. So like the outcome of the Gradavis dilemma was these guys, the Grineer, they won the Gradavis dilemma. They got the most support. So what happened after that was one of the sort of like areas that Warframe had. Oh, I just saw your question, John. Contains stories like a platformer. You have some choice on where you can go, but you will always end up in the same place. Yeah, kind of, if you think about it in sort of like a story sense. Like I said, Telltale is a very good example of a branching but still contained story. They have like specific paths that you can go down. There is technically choice, but not as open as something like this. Yeah, kind of like that. So yeah, basically the way this worked, the Grineer won, so they ended up changing an entire tile set to reflect the outcome of this dilemma. But now that they're no longer doing events, newer players, such as myself, I joined like right after events stopped happening. But I still know the outcomes, partially through word of mouth and partially because they implemented them into the game by making this man, Alid V, a boss that also kind of tied into the story of the Gradavis dilemma, so that then newer players would still know what was happening. But at the same time, they appear to have gotten into a bit of a rut with Alid because they decided to make him a boss not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. And this is kind of getting back into that whole formulaic storytelling sort of thing. Where eventually, Alid popped up again for the 3rd time, and everyone was like, okay, come on, you have more characters. Why aren't you using them? And then after that, they kind of just ditched him, which I feel like was kind of a disservice, but yeah, he's kind of like the Emperor Palpatine of the Warframe universe. Yeah, I will say, like, this is kind of lame compared to the other two, but it is also not a very good picture. I couldn't find any good ones of him post-second boss fight. But yeah, after you've killed the same man 3 different times in a row, you kind of start noticing a pattern. All right, and then on the other hand, we have Starbound, which is a contained story with a much more like sort of linear premise. So basically, Earth gets destroyed, you find this thing called the Ark, you beat all of the other major bosses and get all of the shinies, and then you defeat the big bad. So like here, you have a clear arc with clear goals and a clear sub-goals to go with those goals. So basically, you travel around, you find the things that you need to get to the secondary bosses, you defeat them, you get the little orbs, and then once they're all full, you go here, and then you go here, you defeat the big bad, day is saved, hooray. So, yeah, I had something else to say here, but I kind of forgot it. I'll come back to this if I remember it. But yeah, so that's basically kind of the difference between I'm forgetting the words. The continuous and the contained stories. There we go. So this actually kind of leads into something that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, which is the problem with sequels. Sequels tend to have a reputation, or more of like a pattern, of never really living up to their first game's reputation. And if they ever, like, in the off chance that like the second or third are really good, if they keep making more of them, usually they start going downhill by like game 5 or 6. And this is usually because you're forcing a contained story to become continuous. So, as I said here, the question becomes, where do you go after happily ever after? So, like, you have to find some ways to, like, make the plot the same, but, like, this is also true. You could just never have a happy ending. But they do still have an ending, you know? So, like, you have to sort of, like, you have to stay true to the heart of the franchise and, like, what people loved, you know? People like to see, like, their favorite characters coming back. If you do, like, some callbacks, they'll think that's cool. But if you just repeat the same thing with a bad guy with a different name, and that's literally it, everybody will notice, and it will not be a good time. So a general rule of thumb is, like, it's a good idea to have a new conflict, like brand new conflict, arise from the consequence of the previous game to make them feel like, you know, they connect. One of them had consequences and they carried over into the next one. You can really only pull this off so often before your players sort of start to get a little bit of a defeatist mentality, like, you know, if every time that I solve the problem, another problem comes from that, then what's the point, you know? Let's see, what did John say? Pikmin 2 is a good sequel. The first game centers around getting off the planet alive, and the second is about going back to collect alien treasure after your incompetent coworker puts the company into crippling debt. I mean, I've never played Pikmin 2, but yeah, that is a pretty good example of, you know, conflicts arising from the consequences of the previous games, kind of, because, you know, you wouldn't be able to go back and collect alien treasure if you starved to death on that alien planet. But yeah, so sequels, they kind of have to strike a balance between keeping the right stuff the same and changing the right amount of things, but not changing it too much, which is why eventually, like, you know, eventually you're going to hit the end of that. You're going to run out of, like, you know, feasible consequences that don't feel too, you know, too samey, which is usually why they tend to, like, plummet hard after, you know, a couple iterations. And then there's Pokemon, yeah. Pokemon, I feel like, is just one of those things where it's just eternal. It's one of those, like, exceptions to the rule, if you know. All right, so now we're getting into, like, actual story delivery. I don't actually have a lot for text crawls, ironically, but basically the thing with them is they're easy to make, but they're easy to skip, you know. We've all seen, like, I couldn't actually find a picture of this, and it took me, like, I spent like 20 minutes looking and I couldn't find it. But I'm sure you can all imagine, like, you know, RPG game, you're just running along, you come up to a character, and all of a sudden you have an entire screen of dialogue that you have to read. And nobody likes that, which is probably why I couldn't find it, because people realized that quick and they stopped doing it. And the reason, like, you know, text crawls are generally recommended against is because they're not engaging. They just completely shatter your player's immersion, especially if they're very, very long. And they just completely force your gameplay to a halt because in most text-based dialogue things, you can't move, you can't interact with things. I'm sure you've all seen those clips from Fallout where you're getting like attacked while you're talking to an NPC. Just all of those things make these just kind of an issue. Another thing that you can do is narration, which is just like dialogue in general, but I use narration specifically because we're talking about story development, like not development, delivery. So the nice thing about this is the player doesn't have to stop what they're doing to actually get the information that you're trying to give to them. But the issue is, oh, cool. Happy to have you, Joel. Hope you have fun. Okay. Anyways, back to this. If you're including like the dialogue, for example, like call out or like you're having a conversation with an NPC while you are also doing something, like while you're in the middle of action, the player can very easily miss something. It's very easy for that to happen because so much is happening around them. So one thing that you can do is to either A, try to limit like the really lore heavy important narration to like low downtime things like I was talking about before in like travel sorts of scenes or like even just like sort of lulls in the combat. That's something that you can do. Or you could also try to give the narrator a distinctive voice because that sort of like it gets their character across, even if it's just like basic narration, which is always something that you want to do. Character is like very important. It's one of like the biggest things that you can do to make your story more engaging is to have better character. This too. Remind yourself that overconfidence is a slow and insidious killer. Yes. So I'm going to pull up an example from one of my favorite games, Bastion. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. You probably have. But in Bastion, there's this character, Rux, and he narrates through basically the whole game. He has like, so basically he has like a very deep, distinctive voice. It's gravelly, but in like sort of that comforting grandpa storyteller kind of way, which is basically the role that he takes up in this game. And he describes everything in the game. He describes like the players' actions, items that you look up, items that you pick up, enemies that you encounter, all of those sorts of things. But the thing that makes his narration like really distinctive and that makes it stand out and is good for storytelling as well, is that he doesn't just say like, you know, there's a bunch of enemies and we have to go kill them. He sort of weaves like world relevant similes and references to other things that the player already knows about, and that provides narrative context that you wouldn't have otherwise. And it's very, very well done. If you haven't played Bastion, I absolutely would recommend that you do it. I have like one example from the wiki. It's not the best one, but I did not have time to replay all of Bastion to find some of Rux's best quotes. So this is what we have. You can play it and see just how awesome he is for yourself. But there's also sort of like a little bit, I don't know if this is a spoiler. I don't know if I should tell you this now that I just told you to go play Bastion. But sort of towards the end of the game, Rux's narration changes tense. So for the majority of the game, he's been speaking mostly in past tense. But then there's a bit of a shift in the narrative. And then Rux switches to present for like a little bit. The quote that I pulled, I believe, I can't remember exactly, but I believe that the quote I pulled is from that snippet where he's speaking in present tense. And then after that, his narration stops. And this is at sort of like a point in the story where things are sort of starting to take a darker turn. It's a little bit unsettling, and then Ruck stops talking. And it's kind of like a gradual wind down, but eventually you do notice that Rux isn't there anymore. And that really does also help to sort of drive home that, you know, this is getting really serious, things are ramping up, and like you're all alone at this point in the story. And then at the very end, once, you know, happy ending, well, ending, depending on what you pick. But at the end, everyone comes back together, and then Rock starts talking in future tense to sort of like, you know, it sort of has that sort of like hopeful, uplifting, like, you know, we're going into the sunset, all that lovely stuff. Yeah, it's a really good narrative technique. They use it masterfully in Bastion. It's a wonderful game. I cannot recommend it enough. All right, so maybe not last but not least, but this is one of my last sort of styles that you can use is environmental storytelling. And this is the hardest to pull off because it takes a lot of thought, and your players might not even notice, but if they do, it is incredibly immersive, and it's probably one of the coolest things that you can do. So you can accomplish this through things like, you know, item placement, enemy placement, how the backgrounds change depending on like what happens in the story. The From Software is actually amazing at environmental storytelling. A lot of their, Journey to Abzu is another one that's very good at this. But we have Dark Souls here as sort of an example. From Software games in general, a lot of the story is told not only through like, you know, the descriptions of where you find items and where you are like, just like the item descriptions or like, you know, enemy dialogue, but also like where you find them in the world. So like here in the corner, I have a picture of Havel the Rock. If you I actually haven't played Hollow Knight, I really need to. I would have included something like this. I've seen that it's a very good game. But basically, there's this enemy. I can't remember which Souls game he is from, but he's basically an ancient knight, very well respected. I think this looks like Dark Souls 1 sort of textures. I'm not sure. I actually got some help on this slide, and my friend was actually the one who put in Havel. But yeah, so basically his story is he was once a great knight. He fought against the dragons with like the gods of the world, and that's where his talent comes from. But then I forget exactly what happened, but eventually he got locked away for like until the player comes and finds him, like years and years and years later. He's just been locked in this basement, left to like slowly lose his mind and go hollow, as Dark Souls calls it. So like you get all of Havel's backstory and like what happened to him through like his armor set and his dragon talon. But like the story would not have as much weight. His story would not have as much weight if you just found him wandering around out in like the middle of, I suppose you could call Havel a Hollow Knight. But yeah, so his story would not have nearly as much impact if you didn't run into him in this dingy little circular dungeon basement thing, which is where you find him. His story would have like nowhere near as much impact if you didn't find him where you find him. So yeah, that's basically environmental storytelling. It's kind of hard to have a game that tells their story entirely through environmental storytelling, but it can be an incredibly powerful supplement and make your game just that much more immersive. And lastly, we have Easter eggs, because you can't talk about delivery without Easter eggs and mentioning indie horror. So basically the way that these things work is that you make narrative involvement by not telling the players all of the narrative. And that can be pretty fun. You know, people love a good mystery. They like looking for things. For some people, that's like the entire draw of a game. But like, if you are going to be making Easter eggs, or if you do want to implement like a little bit of a mystery into your game, then you've got to be smart about what you don't tell your players. So like, you know, you've got to strike a little bit of a balance between giving them just enough so that they know that something is missing and their curiosity is piqued and now they're looking. But you don't want to give them so much where it's just like, okay, well, it's clearly this. So at that point, you're just kind of killing the engagement, because what's the point of looking for something if you already know what it's going to be? And another thing that I feel like some indie games, especially indie horror games, a pitfall that they tend to fall into is that you should always know what you are not telling the player. Having a mystery is not an excuse for you not having all the answers. If the player goes on this huge like quest to just find the answers and it turns out that you don't have them or they're not satisfying, there is no worse feeling that you could give to a player and they are not going to be happy. So like in general, the harder it is to find, the bigger the payoff should be. So like you can't have like, you know, this sweeping quest that takes like hours and hours, takes them like on a huge detour off from the main story plot, and then give them some experience and a shiny sword at the end and no story answers when that's what it feels like you were promising them. So this is basically like making a promise to your player. You're promising them that if they keep looking, if they keep investing time and thought and energy into following this narrative trail, it will lead to something. But if your promise is way more than the payoff, they're not going to be very happy about that. And like I said, this is very common in indie horror games, like, you know, FNAF, Bendy, where basically the whole appeal of those games is the fact that you don't know everything. There's so many mysteries, and the appeal comes from trying to figure out how everything got this way and who did what and all of that fun stuff. And lastly, the pitfalls and difficulties of game writing. Many people believe that there is only so many stories that you can tell with games, but this is factually incorrect. There is no limit to the kind of stories or how many stories you can tell with any kind of media. Some are better suited for others, but there is absolutely no limit on the story that you can tell with your game. The issue that games tend to have, however, is that your narrative and your gameplay are often at odds each other and competing for the player's attention. So like for all of the examples that I gave, there is a way for the player to miss it. They might just not look for the Easter eggs. They might miss the dialogue. They might skip the text wall and miss out on like your entire world's backstory. Don't put your entire world's backstory into a text crawl. And then lastly, sort of like the one way that you can make them pay attention, cutscenes are very expensive. They can be jarring. And a lot of people, if they don't want to see the cutscene, they can just skip it the same way that they skip the text. So sort of the thing that you want to do is to make it so that your narrative and your gameplay align, or at least make it so that they're not in each other's way. So like I said before, you can have like the big like dialogue scenes like after like times of high action or in between the like the exciting stuff, sort of, quote unquote, so that like, you know, your player's not going to miss a crucial line of dialogue because a cannon's going off behind their head or anything like that. So you just sort of want to find like this happy balance between when you deliver your narrative, when you deliver your gameplay, and finding ways where you can mesh the two of them nicely is probably like the best thing you can do. In engine rendering, I do not know. I've never actually made a cutscene, but like I was specifically talking about like AAA cutscenes where you have to like, record the dialogue. A lot of them are motion captured now. From what I believe, many games have like cutscene avatars, not avatars, cutscene models that are a lot more detailed than gameplay models. So like all of those things, they're just extra stuff that you have to do that you wouldn't have had to do if you didn't have a cutscene. So that's kind of what I was getting at with the whole cutscenes are expensive thing. Yeah, and then you have to animate them. So yeah, there's a lot of trade-offs. But there is another happy medium that you can take that doesn't involve a lot of trade-offs because it doesn't involve a lot of narrative. And that's Among Us. I can't believe I'm actually bringing this up in a narrative game, but this game just absolutely exploded. And the amount of comics about it is really kind of staggering because if you think about it, there's no dialogue, there's no narrative, there's not even all that much environmental storytelling. It just has a very simple premise, but a very consistent premise of you are scientists in a space base or like just some kind of base, and you have to complete certain tasks while an imposter is hunting you down, which is already a very compelling sort of like gameplay loop. And its themes are held very consistently. But for some reason, the internet just ran with this premise. I have a feeling because of this death animation and the baby crew members. Those two things just absolutely made the Among Us like story community just explode. Yeah, similar with like tabletop RPGs, I have a feeling it has something to do with like people's desire to role play. So basically, what I'm getting at here is that if you give them enough, like the right pieces, if you plant a seed in your players' minds with like a compelling premise, if you keep your themes consistent so that like, if it's all over the place, it's not going, people aren't going to make stories about like Mario Party or whatever. But like, yeah, so if you have like compelling themes, compelling gameplay, consistent themes, and you plant those seeds in your players' minds, they will make their own stories out of those seeds that you gave them, out of the pieces that you gave them. And that can honestly be a lot more compelling for them and can lead to things that you would have never even dreamed of. Like, I guarantee the makers of Among Us did not imagine all of the comics that would come from the Among Us fan base. Because, like, some of those things are, like, really crazy. But yeah, so I posted a couple of videos also talking about this. This one is not game specific, but it does have a lot of very good points about sequels, and the person who makes this does a lot of very good talks about just storytelling tips in general, extra credits. If you're not following them and you like what we do, like in our meetings, you should absolutely watch some of their videos. They're great. And yeah, that's basically all that I have.